When we last left Josette and her chasseur airship Mistral, they had survived and won a great battle against a Vinzalian army invading Garnia. Her hometown Durham was conquered and occupied, and their nearest industrial center and rail hub Arles was nearly taken. Except for Josette's involvement, that spares Garnia a crippling and humiliating defeat, deserved or not. After surviving a near disaster in flight and damage upon a gusty landing and mooring, Josette and Mistral are ordered to Garnia's capital Kuchin to show themselves off to the citizens, and perhaps more importantly, the primary financiers and power brokers of the empire. One would hope in order to inspire material support for Garnia's war, and not just to indulge those excessively pampered. As much as Josette would prefer to prepare her ship and return to the war, while holding out hope that Garnia's war will eventually come around to liberating her hometown Durham, she obeys the order to fly to the capital with at least the latent expectation that her airship will get properly repaired and refitted, if for no greater reason than saving the upper classes the embarrassment of witnessing the competence of their army firsthand. Thanks to the approaching winter season, a weather update not forthcoming, and a culture of obedience to hierarchy over independent action born of good judgment, Mistral is again nearly destroyed in a thunderstorm, and Josette and crew are barely able to come back safely to Earth in one piece, more or less. So until Mistral gets properly repaired, the airship and crew and Josette are properly grounded. Alas, being grounded in their empire's center of power might be an advantage if Josette can impress upon the right power broker the pressing need for her airship to rejoin the war effort, but for the need of materials for a refit. Through her social engagements with Bernat, his brother Roland, and some of Kuchin's upper class, and news of yet another military defeat for Garnia, Josette manages to receive an audience with the King of Garnia himself. Her presumed misstep during that meeting was to ask the king himself for the new battalion of students-turned-soldiers to be diverted from upholding one aristocrat's holdings and titles in favor of reconquering her hometown Durham. The king gives her his blessing to retake Durham with the hopelessly rookie battalion and her airship. But the snubbed aristocrat denies her the parts needed to restore Mistral to prime fighting shape. So Josette takes on the mission to go home with a distinctly more vulnerable airship and a battalion of soldiers that anyone would sensibly bet against. This sets the stage for the battle to return home. Josette's exploits in occupied Durham and the battle executed to take it back leave little to the imagination, thrilling and engaging as the events are that unfold. What I find interesting is the portrayal of the aristocracy and the power they hold, or presume to hold, given how obviously they think themselves as the best of everyone, and no matter how little that's true, how they still manage to hold vast amounts of wealth and influence as far as Garnia and its upper class are concerned. In the face of the ruin and attrition of war, losing soldiers, material, and vessels at a continuous rate, their prime concerns seem to lie, as they seem to have always lied, with the continuity of their wealth, title, honors, and the truly astounding tangle of etiquette that they require to be flattered with. One might expect, given how often they lose soldiers and land in their war with Vinzalia, that they would be incentivized to optimize their society for a war effort that they can win, instead of going by half measures and continuously endangering themselves with military defeats, just to avoid feeling less of their luxuries for the investment. It isn't until yet another disastrous military defeat that the power structure that serves the aristocracy acts to quell fears of Vinzalian conquest the best way it knows how, finding whoever's unlucky enough not to make themselves scarce and swear them in as proud soldiers of the Guardian military. No need for consent, it is implied after all. for the glory of the king. This includes the young men of the capital's university, many of whom are said to be the children of the nobility, but conspicuously not members of the nobility themselves. The self-supposed best of Garnia won't go to war, but will delegate that responsibility to their heirs, believing or probably half-believing that their noble blood is enough to stave off defeat. While Josette stays in the capital to see her airship repaired and refitted, after the famous military defeat rouses her and the capital of its indulgent stupor, a new battalion of soldiers is trained and outfitted at the same time she gets her airship ready for Durham. The soldiers in question are the students of the local university, and they are far and away unfit and unready for the life of becoming soldiers. As befitting the prestigious universities they came from, theirs is portrayed as an arduous journey to taking on the burdens of war, complaining all the way. If we remember how Burnett felt and behaved when informed how he was now a proud soldier in the king's army, imagine an entire class of Burnies going through the stages of grief many times over. Before we go any further, I want to point out that there is plenty of valid reasons for complaining. Not simply what the recruits explicitly griped about, but mainly the implications of the truly expansive list of what goes into the soldier's kit. Out of the many, many, many items listed for the newly minted soldiers to carry, some make sense. Kits for sewing, cooking, and making camp are good for maintaining sustenance and shelter outdoors. Some are tools of the trade, firearms, ammunition, and all necessary accessories for operation and maintenance. But some are truly incongruous. The plethora of polishes and brushes seem fit for parades more than for marches and battles. I don't really know what full kit real-life musketeers used, but if so many brushes and polishes weren't a universal requirement, I should think the Garnian military places more value on their battalions being presentable rather than combat-ready, likely to indulge the fashion sense of nobility. It reminds me of a bit of military humor. According to Murphy's Laws of Combat, no combat-ready unit has ever passed inspection, and no inspection-ready unit has ever passed combat. As for one of the lucky recruits' presumption that some industrialist is getting rich off the war by selling kit items, it's dubious whether they're getting rich selling patent items or having to mass-produce items at the lowest bid, so quality takes a back seat to quantity. It is probably more certain that whoever owns the production of military kit is taking a substantial share of the allotted funding, leaving little for the labor and maintenance of the production itself. If anyone owned a production line and wanted to get rich off of selling military kit, there's no shortage of the kit that's in shortage for the Guardian Army. Just as a point of reference, after World War II, there were substantial surpluses of material and supplies in the United States after wartime production was no longer needed. In Garnia, however, there might be a shortage of productive labor, industrial capital, and resources on account of aristocratic ownership. It would explain why soldiers need to constantly loot the battlefield. After all, the nobility can't be expected to spend money in their own empire's military and war. They're too important. As for recruiting students into soldiers, the so-called fangless fops, Garnia is wasting an opportunity that real-life militaries regularly take advantage of, recruiting the educated into military careers that strengthen the competence and innovation of a nation's armed forces. There's a variety of ranks mentioned in both books. However, what's of interest to recruiting educated youth is the prevalence and relevance of commissioned and non-commissioned officers that have authority to lead enlisted men into battle independent of direct command from superior noble officers. If Garnia only allows military movement based on explicit orders from the highest ranks, then individual units in the field may be left to waste opportunities for independent action, whether exploiting enemy weakness to advance or securing defenses against attack. Such a system gives initiative for the army only to the extent of the noble superior officer's control. Based on what we've seen in story, there's plenty of cause for concern as to their efficacy. The alternative is a system of control where superior officers outline army objectives, and the means to achieve these goals is entrusted to field officers, both commissioned and non-commissioned, so that units can react as they see battlefield developments in real time. As opposed to noble-blooded superior officers conscripting and placing uneducated fighting men like pieces on a chessboard, educated officers can use their studies and knowledge in military logistics, organization, training, drilling, maneuvering, and overall leadership to empower their enlisted fighting men into becoming better at surviving and fighting in battles and waging war. Supposing the newly recruited fighting philosophers have had no substantial studies in military operations, they would still be valuable to the state, supposing the aristocratic political system saw fit to utilize them. Garnia has gotten itself into a ruinous war, that much should be clear by this point, and the state has a great deal to lose if they do not recover and update their military strength, such that they can end the war on terms that are, if not beneficial in the zero-sum sense, are at least not ruinous. The army and nobility they serve need as much support as they can get, lest they are reduced to throwing absolutely everyone at the war as a meat shield, just to protect themselves. Servants included, heaven forbid. To drum up support for the war effort, and to essentially convince as much of Garnia as possible to support the war effort, would require a massive campaign of outreach, propaganda if you will, to convince as many citizens as possible to save resources for the war and produce what is needed to prosecute the war. That's where the university students come in. Even if they can't fight, they can use their knowledge in literature, communication, and presentation to try and show everyone in Garnia that fighting in and supporting the war is a matter of the utmost importance for Garnia, the king, and by extension, the people themselves. After all, if we take Bernat's case as typical of the noble, young, and educated, like these students, then convincing them to convince everyone else of the righteousness of the Garnian cause shouldn't be too hard, especially for those not privy to the current reality at the front. If the Garnian king, nobility, and army need the Garnian nation to become a true wartime economy in order to protect their territory and nation, then getting the noble, educated youth working on drumming up public support for the war effort would be essential. We can see the descendants of these programs in the modern-day close cooperation between higher education institutions, sporting events, and entertainment media, and military recruitment. Based on the actions and notions of the characters in story, however, they may only just be starting down the path to realizing the truth in this possibility. Whether it comes to pass and pays off like we've seen in our real history, it's outside the scope of the story, and likely this editorial. You may rightly notice how such a system and course of action would be manipulative and exploitative of the people involved and engaged by that kind of program. In which case, let me bluntly say, that's just one of the many injustices and larger tragedy of the Garnian-Vinzalian War that we have seen in story. As best I can tell, an entire nation's upper class decided that peace between themselves and their neighbors just didn't afford them the wealth and title they thought they deserved. So they decided to conquer, only to squander their military power, and their superior intellect can only come up with throwing more warm bodies at the problem and silently hope that they don't lose too much of what territory and resources they used to control. Instead of accepting that their collective choice for war was ill-conceived and becoming ruinous, such that they might sue for a peace to preserve their standing, the nobility instead chooses to keep throwing good soldiers and good resources after bad outcomes, like a gambler throwing away money to try and hit a jackpot. In a way, this type of attitude filters down the military chain of command, and we actually get to see this in the character of Hannon. When Josette and Mistral returned to base to begin repairs, their loyal executive officer, Lieutenant Martel, was promoted to captain of his own airship to command. So, a replacement was in order from story's start. In the capital Kuchin, after a season of airship repairs, the crew gets their replacement in Lieutenant Hannon, whose first appearance was to smoke a cigarette too close to an airship filled with inflammable air, not to mention belittling Ensign Kember at the same time, and later patronizing Captain Josette on sharing the burden of command. Notwithstanding Hannon's relevant experience and expertise in airship operations, and especially notwithstanding his obliviousness to the competence of the crew and officers he flew with on Mistral, Hannon's time of fame comes from during the operation to take Durham, where a Vinzalian airship, copied almost exactly from Mistral, draws Hannon, commanding Mistral in Josette's absence, into a chase away from Durham. As far as supporting the battle to come, it's an obviously bad move to go chasing an airship that's not threatening the troops, and not only leaving the troops exposed, but also leaving Mistral vulnerable, more so than usual, as she's still filled with inflammable air and her steam jack is ready to spew embers, fit to burn her at any moment if unsupervised. With a steam jack that's ready to send them down in flames at a moment's inattention, and an enemy airship that always seems just out of range no matter what engine power and speed they achieve, it should have been obvious to Hannon that he was being baited into leaving the troops unprotected and the assault unsupported. We can trust that Josette, Kember, and any other mission-minded commander would have ceased the chase and returned to station to help in the battle to come. Hannon does not. Hannon doesn't want to admit he's been fooled into a useless chase. Thus he wants to down the enemy vessel and bring back the victory to justify his foolish action, because if he doesn't, what will everyone think of him? To illustrate Hannon's flawed character and choices, we might consider how to view his disposition if it were Josette commanding Mistral to chase down an enemy obviously baiting them into losing their mission. Up to this point, we've already seen an enemy scout try to bait Josette into pursuit, and Josette let it go, to maintain overwatch of the battalion heading for Durham. It may not have turned out not to be needed, but as we've seen the effect of an airship attack can have on troops, like Mistral's attack on enemy troops in the first book, it upholds the notion better to be prepared and not needed, than needed but not prepared. If Josette was presented the subsequent Mistral copycat as bait, we might trust that she would have chased only so far as to keep it away from the troops, and only stayed to fight if returning to the station made them too vulnerable. As the story unfolds, she ends up flying and fighting while under fire from that airship anyway. As for Hannon's choice to risk the troops' protection in order to claim an airship kill, we explicitly know the mission is not on his mind. Only a promotion to major. And despite the fact that Ensign Kember remembers the mission, she doesn't openly remind him lest he summarily condemn her to arrest, trial, and punishment on charge of insubordination. Just like how the nobility are expected to get their way no matter what circumstances and larger goals demand, superior officers, even in airship flight and warfare, where mistakes are easy to make and supremely deadly, are apparently afforded the same power. In the hands of negligent superior officers like Hannon, Mistral is clearly in danger, and there's no telling how many airships were lost to such poor examples of leadership. All of this is in service to a sunk cost fallacy that dominates Hannon's story, and in parallel, the story of the Garnian nation at large. What little we hear of Hannon's story can be summarized thusly. He was a field officer in the Garnian infantry, and led a desperate and deadly attack that he survived, but was denied an award and promotion normally afforded to survivors of such an attack. No one says why, so he's transferred to the Aerial Signal Corps to serve as skipper on a few non-rigid scouts and get a promotion of first officer of a rigid chasseur airship, on Mistral, as it were. We can't be certain what personal and professional attributes superiors saw in Hannon to see fit to assign him to Mistral. We have only the character's suspicions of some fault in Hannon that denied him recognition for a past action that might drive him to make poor decisions in this story. Or maybe someone thought a woman captain must require support for command. Whatever the speculation, the culmination of Hannon's time on Mistral is pushing the airship and crew to chase down a dangerous and well-positioned enemy, compromising the mission and the airship's safety, thus convincing the crew to give Hannon an accident, killing him before they can return to Durham and retrieve Captain Josette and finish the mission to retake Durham. Hannon's mistake was to think he could leave his station and pursue personal glory, and when he couldn't, his further mistake was to continue endangering Mistral and crew in order to make up for the first mistake, thinking an enemy kill would forgive all sins. But in pushing the crew and airship to the point of getting themselves blown up, he had ensured that no amount of cultural pressure to obey one's superiors would overcome the crew's sense of survival. Captain Josette would have long recognized the foolishness of the choice and accepted the mistake with grace, because she cares for and has proven herself to her crew and airship. Hannon cared only for his reputation and did not care for those under his command, and so paid dearly for it, and nearly made everyone else pay dearly as well. Despite putting on airs of praise for the engineering crew, Private Gray and Mechanic Magusi, and later trying to bribe the crew with the shared glory, what Hannon was doing was probably what presumed superiors all over Garnia might do. That is, to use their position to validate their subordinates into indulging their requests or commands, as if the enforcement and validation of hierarchy would somehow be enough to overcome the mechanics of physical reality, and grant their desires. But flying and fighting, just like survival in war, is not accommodating to poor judgment. Mistral and crew could only survive despite Hannon, and by removing him from command. Without bylaws or regulations allowing the removal or relief of compromised command officers, Hannon's death was assured, one way or another. If the misadventure between Hannon and Mistral's crew can in any way be seen as parallel to Garnia's misadventure in the war at large, then whatever ruination the nobility has, does, and may yet inflict on Garnia's people, may in time break the people's notion of their ruling class as the best of us, and the people may find ways to make them irrelevant, one way or another. Suffice it to say, the only way the Garnian king can preserve the unity of the Garnian nation under its current hierarchy is to regain peace as quickly as possible. How the monarch could accomplish this would be another discussion altogether, one outside the scope of this editorial. As for the Garnian ruling classes, the lesson they and others might learn is that sometimes the best way to preserve your station in society is not to gamble on a war. With an airship more vulnerable than before, and troops that couldn't be more green, Josette returns to Durham to find it garrisoned by a diminished but battle-hardened regiment of Vinzalian soldiers, who were themselves further hardened by the hardship of fighting a dedicated local resistance against their occupation. To even the odds and recapture her hometown, and in particular safeguard her mother, Josette, Bernat, and Jutes infiltrate the town and try to foster an insurrection to divide the garrison's strength and give the assaulting battalion a chance at success. After connecting to the local resistance leaders, Josette and crew join her mother Elise and the Durhamites in assaulting enemy positions, only to be cornered at every turn and captured. At the height of the battle to retake Durham, when Josette and company are captive of the Vin garrison, she is also given the surprise of her life. Her mother Elise cooperating with the Vin officer, both current and in the past, in exchange for Josette's life. The revelations come pouring out. Josette's parents, that is, her father Mehmed, came from Vinzalia. The Dupreys lived in Durham when it was Vinzalian, and fled when Garnia invaded, only to come back while hiding their Vin origins. Her mother Elise and father Mehmed apparently meant to return to Vinzalia, but then Josette came along, and the trip was postponed until finally Mehmed was conscripted into Garnia's army, and Elise stayed in Durham to finish raising Josette, until Josette joined the Garnian army as well, leaving her mother Elise in Durham. As Garnia and Vinzelia fought their war, Elise passed information on to Vinzelia in order to get by, and when Josette returned to Durham after so many years, Elise stole the blueprints of Mistral and did everything she could to induce Josette to leave before the Vin invasion arrived. When Josette returned to Durham, Elise made a deal with the Vin command to deliver them the resistance in exchange for Josette's life. Before the revelations, we learn a few things about Elise from Josette as the books go on. She is skilled enough as a hunter to not only feed herself and her family, but also to sell the meat and animal products to the town and save a fair amount of money for Josette. That Josette uses to buy a commission in Garnia's army irks Elise, when she would have wanted her to pursue higher education and a better life outside of Garnia. In light of the revelation of Elise's allegiance to her husband's country of birth, she expresses her contempt for Durham, and how likely they would have strung her up, and Josette too, if they knew her lineage. Loyalty notwithstanding, such was the suppression of Vin identity when Garnia took over Durham. This mirrors Josette's own enmity towards Durham as well. Of course, her own service to Vinzelia's war effort did not spare her from being made homeless, nor would it spare Josette from execution, as the Vin command rejects their agreement in favor of ridding themselves of a notorious enemy airship captain. In response, Elise blows up their gunpowder magazine, kicking off the beginning of the end for the Vin's Durham occupation. Following the battle, Josette reflects on how things would be different if she were told her heritage by her father. In no uncertain terms, because of how much she valued her father, she would have accepted her identity as Vin, and still loved him for it. I wouldn't be surprised if she took a commission in the army to fly airships so that she could, in a way, be close to her father even after he died in the service. At the heart of the Dupre family's tragic history, and the schism between daughter and mother Dupre, is something I spoke about in the supplemental of the first book, The Guns Above, how national borders violate people. Dupre's family was closely connected to Durham's history, and a war between Vinzelia and Garnia changed not just control of the town, but the very culture of the town, turning it from something that may have been pretty inclusive as far as border communities go, into an insular, exclusionary society where anyone with a past too closely aligned to a current imperial rival leads to persecution and suffering, and for no greater end than maintaining a national purity and aristocratic privilege. What stands out is that we don't get any real ideas as to what meaningful cultural differences between Garnet and Vinzelia would translate to greater moral authority and induce greater loyalty, both from their own people and from prospective turncoats. As easily as Josette could have pledged loyalty to Vinzelia upon the hypothetical reveal from her parents, she just as easily pledged to Garnia upon her army commission, and may have been just as invested in Vinzelia's war effort as she was in Garnia's throughout the books. Just as one being monarchist and the other being royalist can be taken as a distinction without a difference, so too could Josette look upon her own possible alternate future and see essentially no difference in her life course. In Josette's and Elisa's story, I personally see the remnant of a cultural identity that predates the Garnian and Vinzelian national identity, that wage war over their communities and their lives, where relations to a town and between towns were more important than to a centralized, national, and especially aristocratically dominated state. As she affirmed herself before story's end, loyalty is a damn peculiar thing. Despite Josette's bitter resentment of her mother, especially inflamed by her betrayal, their story resolves with Josette and Bernat freeing Elise from captivity, sparing her the hangman's noose, and letting her free to go and find her way elsewhere, likely towards Vinzelia. As Josette finally saw evidence that her mother really did care for her, even if embittered in her absence, she finally chose letting her live rather than upholding Garnia's, and indeed her own mandate, to kill all Vinzalians in Garnian territory. Such is the conclusion of Josette and Mistral's story, as of this recording. Personally, I can't help but wonder at how Josette's story might continue after the last page. Maybe she'll be kept stationed at Durham to reconstitute the signals base and defend against further incursions. Or maybe she'll be sent to Qua and the meat grinder. Despite her competence and good luck so far, there's a very real possibility that she could still be killed before the war is over. If she survives to see war's end, I would hope she could find some peace, whether while flying her airship or finding someone to spend time with away from military life and the constant threat of death. As for Garnia, I wouldn't get too attached to any notion that they'll get a heroic ending to their war, and frankly the nobles will be lucky not to lose too much and keep their precious self-image intact. Perhaps the king will get an opportunity to further empower people like Josette, kept down by the aristocratic system, into rising above their station, and changing Garnian culture into something people in story, and us readers, can really root for. Imagine Ensign Kember gets to shine after being empowered the way Josette was. Making Josette captain of Mistral gave Garnia a hero, and Vinzalia a nemesis in The Shark. So if Kember gets her chance to grow into command, maybe she'll get to stand out just as well. If Kember's skills with gunnery and her sense to protect the crew and troops is anything to go by, maybe she'll get a reputation as the ground soldier's guardian angel. And it will be fitting, too. Another future story I hope is possible in this written world is the rule that women auxiliary officers must be dropped off before battle gets used to create a force of women paratroopers. Imagine that the auxiliary officers get trained not just to fight as fusiliers, but to be deployed from airships, whether by landing or by airdropping. We've already seen this with Josette and crew dropping from Mistral in both books to join battles on the ground. And parachutes are regularly used by balloonists, just as they were in real history. Put it all together, and there'd be another fighting force that would pointedly obey the word but not the spirit of the law. The aristocrats that came up with the law would richly deserve that egg on their face. But that would be just my indulgence. As of recording, Bennis hasn't written anything more in the Signal Airship series, so my thoughts could only be the stuff of fanfiction. For everyone listening, I thank you for following along for the duration of both books in Robin Bennis's Signal Airship series. And I hope you'll indulge me again when next we return to the world of Crimson Skies. And this time around, it's a double feature. First is a short story continuing the adventure of aviation security pioneer Paladin Blake as he seeks out a secret city made exclusively by and for pirates. Then we return to the ostensible main character of Crimson Skies, Nathan Zachary, and see his origin from a wannabe ace pilot of World War I to becoming the heroic flying ace, as we'll find in the debut novel, Wings of Fortune, Pirate's Gold.